Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Greg MACPHERSON, president of City Club. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Eco Northwest, Chevron, Girding Edlin, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. Next week, City Club will hold two great after-hour programs. On Monday, we are watching and discussing the film Sick Around the World, a documentary explaining how other industrialized countries provide better health care to more people for less money than the U.S. On Thursday, you can join Alicia Nagel, the creative mind behind City Club's logo, for a workshop on brand strategy. Next week's Friday Forum will be presented in partnership with the AmeriCorps Vista program in recognition of its 50th anniversary. We will hear from two alumni of the program, Nancy Hales, First Lady of Portland, and Rachel Bristol, former CEO of the Oregon Food Bank. They will be joined on a panel by National Director of AmeriCorps Vista and former White House aide, Paul Montero. You can learn more about these and other City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, PDXCITYCLUB.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. Carol Collymore will facilitate the discussion with today's panel. Those in the audience may participate by writing a question on one of the index cards found at the center of the tables. Hold your cards up high and City Club staff will collect them during the program. And now for today's program. Attitudes about gender are changing. In the past, the change was mainly about the roles played by males and females in society. But more recently, we are reconsidering the nature of gender itself. The men's Olympic decathlon determines the greatest all-around athlete in each generation. This month, the winner of that event earlier in life is featured as Caitlyn Jenner in a stunning photo on the cover of Vanity Fair. Also, Laverne Cox of Orange is the New Black was recently the first transgender person to appear on the cover of Time magazine. As a result of these and other developments, we know that old preconceptions must be set aside. Today, we will delve deeper into this subject and hear how transgender lives are affected by changing attitudes here in Oregon and elsewhere. Today's panel includes Carolyn Desert, the Executive Director of Immigration Equality, JAYCE M., a senior at George Fox University, Reed Vanderberg, who is an author and one of the first therapists to focus on working with transgender clients, STACEY Rice, the Executive Co-Director for Operations and Programming at the Portland Q Center, and NICO Quintana, who's the Policy Director at Basic Rights Oregon. Today's panel will be moderated by Carol Collymore, the Executive Director of the Equity Foundation, and, I'm proud to say, a member of City Club's Board of Governors. Please welcome the panel to Friday Forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm Carol Collymore, Executive Director of the Equity Foundation. We are a community foundation that focuses on the economic, political, and social justice for the LGBTQ community, and also a member of the Board of Governors here at City Club. In the LGBTQ movement, the T stands for transgender, and by definition, transgender is a term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. Gender identity refers to a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else, and gender expression refers to the way a person communicates gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Transgender people have never had a large part of the spotlight in the midst of the L, the G, and the B issues. Because of that, the broader community has suffered from the lack of understanding. With the rise of famous folks that are transgender, as Greg McPherson just mentioned, we are in a space of more openness, desire for understanding and acceptance towards trans people. So we're here today to offer some insight, some personal perspective, some context for this burgeoning conversation. And there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. So I'm going to give the panel a chance to introduce themselves, and I will start with STACEY Rice.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Excuse my voice today, by the way. I've got allergy issues, major. Just bear with me. Thank you. Hi, I'm STACEY Rice. I'm the co-executive director of Q Center, in charge of programs and operations there. Q Center is Portland's LGBTQ community center, and we provide programs and services for a wide range of folks in Southwest Washington, Portland, the greater Portland area. I am a Southern refugee. I moved to Portland 3.5 years ago. So thrilled and happy to be in Portland, Oregon. You just don't know. I am also a trans woman. I transitioned 15 years ago. And I appreciate the opportunity today to be able to tell my story and give you maybe some more insight into the trans community. And thank you to the City Club for having us.
Good afternoon. My name is Kara Desert, and I am the Executive Director at Immigration Equality. I'm a cisgender queer Latina, originally from a rural farming community on the border of Mexico and California. I'm delighted to be here with you all. Immigration Equality is the nation's largest LGBT immigrant rights organization. We do both direct service, winning asylum for LGBT immigrants across the country. We currently have 550 clients across 25 states, including, unfortunately, just one in the state of Oregon, but we're working on growing so that we can serve the undocumented community where we are most needed. We also do policy work. Our #1 policy priority is advocating for LGBT people, particularly trans women, trapped in our detention centers, and I look forward to talking to you all about that issue soon. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back here in Portland.
I'm Jace Montgomery. My speech is not going to be as long because I'm not part of an organization yet, but I go to George Fox University. I'm currently a senior there. Last year, I had a housing battle with them over housing discrimination for transgender students. So I filed a complaint with the Department of Education and went back and forth with them over the housing rights, and we finally got somewhat of a trans policy that now exists at George Fox. So that's great. I'm really happy to be here and share my story. So thank you for having me.
And I'm Reed Vanderberg, and I'm a former therapist. I've practiced here for about 15 years, and almost all of my clients were transgender. I've heard so many different stories. I've seen the face of transition change in this city over the years, and especially since I transitioned here myself starting about 20 years ago. So I have a lot of history in this city, and I've seen a lot of changes, and it's really exciting to see the changes that are coming along now. Feels like things are moving faster and faster all the time in the direction toward equality, but at the same time, there's a lot of backlash going on.
Hello, my name is NICO Quintana, and I'm the Policy Director at Basic Rights Oregon. Basic Rights Oregon is Oregon's statewide LGBT advocacy group, and I also help oversee our transgender justice program, which is actively fighting and advocating for the rights of transgender people across Oregon in the areas of health, housing, and employment. Right now, we're trying to implement Oregon Health Plan and also working with Department of Corrections and Oregon Youth Authority to ensure that trans folks that are in custody are treated with respect and dignity. Me personally, I'm from Eugene, Oregon. I came out very young when I was 13, and I was homeless as a homeless LGBTQ youth. I came out as trans when I was very young as well, and I've been a part of the transgender justice rights movement for about 15 years, and so much has happened. I'm excited to be a part of this panel. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to talking more about what's to come. Thanks.
Okay, Reed, I want to start with you, as you have so much context about what's happened in Oregon. You've been part of the community for over 30 years. Can you share with us some of the trans history in Oregon?
Well, that's a big topic for a couple of minutes. I haven't formally studied the history of trans population here, but just generally, I've heard a lot of stories of people who considered transition, backed away from it, were afraid they would not be able to hold their jobs or keep their families together, pay the bills, feared for their safety. Either they would transition and then try to never tell anyone, which was certainly possible before the internet age. Now it's virtually impossible to transition and leave your old identity behind and know that no one will ever find out. But these days, it's also less certain that you have to do that. Many more people are transitioning now, staying put in the same job they had before, not necessarily moving on, telling friends that they meet after transition when they don't really have to. And that's putting a face to transition and what it looks like to be trans that we've never had an opportunity to experience before culturally. There have been so many stereotypes and misperceptions about what trans looks like. And now those are breaking down because people realize, I mean, I look around this room and I think any one of you here could be trans and no one would know it. I don't know it, so I don't assume it. And that's one of the things that I see happening now is that people, especially younger people, are less inclined to assume that they know other people's gender or sexuality.
You had shared with us earlier that when you, in the past 30 years, you've seen the work that has happened between the trans community and the gay community. And you know, we talked a little bit about how trans folks have gotten left out of a lot of the movement. Can you tell me about how those intersections worked?
Those intersections are still happening with varying degrees of success. Again, I see a generational difference in the approach. Younger people that I know are more inclined to be more fluid in the way they view gender and sexuality both. And so they're not altogether surprised when somebody says to them, oh, I prefer this pronoun, despite how they look. I find that older people are a little more, I don't want to say rigid because it sounds like they are rigid people, but it's a cultural artifact of being rigid about how we pigeonhole gender. You're either male or female, that's that. If someone says that's not me, it's very hard to make that kind of change in your own mind. I sing in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus, and I certainly have seen that in the chorus, the younger members having a somewhat easier time at times accepting people who say, oh, this is who I am and not this. But they certainly make the effort. And that's one thing that I've seen change over the years is that there's more willingness to take people seriously and take the issues seriously in lesbian and gay community. I transitioned out of lesbian community. I was part of the Portland lesbian community for over 20 years. There are people in this room that I knew from that time period. And I've seen a shift in that community toward more acceptance than would have been the case 20, 30 years ago. But again, I think it's part of the larger cultural visibility of trans identity. That's translating also to gay and lesbian community as well.
And in your profession, as you mentioned, as a therapist, you had an opportunity to serve a lot of folks going through transition. And I think some folks get caught up in the difference between orientation and gender and they don't quite get it. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. Sexuality is all about your relationships with other people. Who do you fall in love with? What community do you claim as being your tribe? But your gender, when you're looking in the mirror and you're all by yourself and you see a reflection back at you that other people will call a man or a woman, are you okay with that? It's a more deeply personal form of identity that doesn't really translate to who you're attracted to. It's all about your relationship to yourself.
Great. Now, JAYCE, I want to talk to you. So you mentioned a little bit about the housing discrimination you faced at George Fox. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that was with you and your friends and George Fox itself?
Yeah, so coming into George Fox, I had no intentions on transitioning. I knew I was transgender, but you know, I was scared. I was scared to transition. I was scared to lose friends. I was scared not to make, you know, new friends in a new place. So I was like, you know what, I can ride out 4 years, I can get through and transition after. Obviously, that doesn't work when you're not being who you are. So it caught up to me. So the end of my freshman year, I decided to transition. So going into my sophomore year of college, I already had a set group of people who I wanted to live with. They were females at the time, and I was fine with that at that point. But as the school year kind of went on, it kind of started to, you know, it wasn't working. You know, my body was changing, my voice was changing, all of that, and I was not really comfortable living with women. So I went to the school, you know, asking to live with males for my junior year, and they denied me because they said my biological sex was female. And that was really hard for me because it was the first time that, you know, someone had actually said, you know, it stops here, you can't go any further, you know, you can't live with men. And it was really hard. So I got an attorney, which was Paul Southwick, and we had a battle with the school. We filed a complaint with the Department of Education. That was denied on the basis that, George Fox is a private university and that, they're entitled to, certain rules that, other people don't have to follow. So it just, went back and forth. We did a lot of, meetings and, media. And we ended up, with a trans policy that is not, inclusive of everybody, but it's still a step in the right direction, so I'm happy for that. At George Fox, honestly, the teachers are great, the students are great. I've really had I haven't been bullied, I've had really no problem except for the housing thing. So that's been really great to have that support.
So for George Fox, for those of you who don't know, is a private Christian university. And JAYCE, you're young, you're Christian, you're Black. That's a lot of intersection, and you are comfortable in that space. Can you talk about intersectionality and how that fosters your communication with other groups of folks?
Yeah, so one thing that I really realized through this process with George Fox was that, we all possess identities that overlap. We're not just gay, we're not just straight, we're not just trans, we're Black, we're women, we're men, everything. So that was, something that I really started to think about, what does it mean to be a Black trans man? What does it mean to be Christian and trans? And so all of that, and just, I think, really understanding that we all possess identities that overlap really helps to be able to foster, good communication between people, and being able to understand that we all have, some of the same struggles and that we can all come to a middle ground. So, yeah.
And what inspired you to speak about your personal story and what got you to that point?
A couple of things. So again, just realizing that, we all possess different identities and that this is not the only issue of discrimination. As an African American, I face discrimination, often. So realizing that, this is not just a trans rights issue. This is a lesbian issue. This is a gay issue. This is all of issues that are, unequal. And so realizing that and realizing, that someone needs to step forward and speak, whether, it's me or somebody else, somebody has to do it. And, for a while I really considered leaving George Fox University and going to a different school. But I realized that, that wouldn't do any good, and that I needed to stay and fight, and speak out, not only for, other transgender students to come, but also, for African American students and, other people who experience inequality and discrimination as well.
Kara, we're going to talk to you next. So legally and through the criminal justice system, what should folks know about trans folks, especially trans women of color, and how they're being profiled by the police?
Yeah, our clients are really dealing with multiple oppressions happening at the same time. We know that racial profiling is a problem. We also know that gender profiling is a problem. People who don't look like what major law enforcement considers to be a good, upstanding citizen, particularly for our trans women of color. Many immigrants who come to this country come in an immigrant cohort, and that immigrant cohort has lots of safety nets. Folks live in the same community, they help raise each other's children, they help support each other, and they help with resources that are needed for survival. Many of, all of our clients are fleeing fundamentally unsafe countries. Here, we're really standing on the edge of history with what we hope is a marriage equality decision coming down any day now. And there's an anti-LGBT movement happening internationally at the same time. So places like Russia, Uganda, and El Salvador, folks are fleeing, and they're coming here fleeing persecution. Many of our clients are turned away from their immigrant cohort. They try to get resources in their communities here in the United States and are rejected because the people in their immigrant cohorts have the same prejudice that they fled from in the first place. And so our clients are incredibly vulnerable. They tend to come rather than traveling here in an immigrant cohort, they come by themselves. And so particularly trans women of color who come to this country are really living in unstable housing, have astronomical rates of homelessness, have difficult accessing social services. So multiple oppressions are coming together, both transphobia and racism. to really make folks very vulnerable. And so our trans clients tend to congregate outside because they don't have access to a safe place to be with each other. And then we find that in those areas, there's an increased police presence. They're more likely to be picked up for petty things. And because they don't have access to stable work authorization, they often engage in what we call survival crimes, sex work, and petty theft. So they're more likely to be criminalized and to come into contact with the criminal justice system.
I've never heard survival crimes before. I just learned something. That's an interesting phrase. So with that happening, there are also detention issues, and that is, it doesn't matter if you're undocumented or not. There are these detention issues that specifically happen when you're transgender. Can you tell us about what those are and if there are any remedies coming?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to focus on immigrant detention. So, there's some misconceptions out there that undocumented people who are in detention centers committed crimes. I'm here to tell you that that's not true. If you come across the border and you say, I'm fleeing persecution from my country, you automatically go to a detention center as a right of course. So our detention centers are filled with people who have committed no criminal penalty and have committed a civil violation in some cases by being here undocumented and not crossing the border and claiming asylum, but in other cases, actually crossing the border and claiming asylum and going to a detention center. These are fundamentally unsafe places for LGBT immigrants. Gay men are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in a detention center, and trans women are housed in male facilities are 13 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault. I know many people here have experienced trauma from bullying. Our clients are locked up with their bullies. This is a human rights atrocity. It is our #1 policy priority to ensure that LGBT people are treated fairly throughout the entire immigration system. But I met with the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, about a month ago to talk about this critical issue. And I told him, if you cannot house our community safely, and it is clear with these statistics that you cannot, then you should not house them at all. So this is, an absolute critical issue for our clients who are fleeing persecution. To be exposed to that same persecution here on U.S. soil in our detention centers is a human rights atrocity. And so trans people are treated unfairly throughout the entire criminal justice system, including prisons and jails, and even being policed in their neighborhoods. But for our clients fleeing persecution, we're really deeply concerned. The government has a tool that evaluates whether somebody should or should not be in detention. But oftentimes, even when the government's own system says someone should not be detained, they are detained anyways, because our detention centers are largely private enterprises, and there's a bed mandate that's established by Congress. 34,000 beds in our detention centers must be filled, and so there are many different interests happening. But in the end, the justification for putting people in detention is to ensure that they show up for our court date. Our asylum-seeking clients, because we win 98% of our cases, have every interest in showing up. And so we advocate for community programs, alternatives to detention, even ankle monitoring to get our clients out of what we consider a fundamentally unsafe place.
So Stacey, we're gonna move on to you. You can grab the microphone. So share with us how you knew you were different from your peers when you were a kid in the South.
Oh, in the South, yes. I'd be more than happy to do that. As you can imagine, the transgender journey is a pretty difficult one at times. In my story, I think, is very typical of most trans people in the fact that, around 4 or 5 years old, you all of a sudden realize that maybe your internal view of yourself doesn't match up at all with what the outside world sees. In my case, I was being treated like this little boy that they saw, but I was like, well, wait, I'm actually a little girl. What's going on here? I don't understand this. It was a tough, as you can imagine, a very difficult place to be, especially at the age that I am and the generation I grew up. There was really no way to explain this. I grew up in the 60s. I was 10 years old in 1967. How do you tell someone this? So my way of dealing with it was holding it all in and just trying to understand it the best way I could. It took until I was 10 years old that I actually finally got confirmation of who I was. I'll never forget, there was a television show on. Of course, there were only 3 channels at that time. But it was a news story about Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen was really the first very high publicized person who had what they called at that time a sex change operation. And the lead into this article was that meet the GI who used to be a boy and now is a girl. I could hardly breathe. I thought, what is this? They had the story, it came on, and Christine Jorgensen explained exactly my life. It was so incredible. For the first time ever, I was not alone. I felt like, well, wait, there is something to this. I wasn't making all this up. So as you can imagine, the journey from there until when I transitioned 15 years ago was a long one, a difficult one, pretty dark times at times. But I got to the point where that decision had to be made. I either had to move on with my life and be who I truly was, or I had to go a different direction, which was not pleasant. I decided to go the positive direction. And the confirmation for me in my life was I had been on hormones for about 6 months. So as you start the transition, you have a hormone regimen. Things were changing. My face was becoming more feminine looking. And it was 6 months into those treatments that I actually woke up one morning and walked into my bathroom. And I looked in the mirror and, oh my God, for the first time ever, I saw my true self. I had never seen it before that. Reed alluded to that in his comments. I finally had a match with who I saw in the mirror to who I was. And it still brings me joy. I still got chill bumps just talking, because it brings me joy to this day to have that experience and know that I actually did find my true self.
How did your family and friends react, and were you able to tell them and show them?
That came a lot later on. Of course, being born and raised in the South, I had a pretty conservative family. We all went to the Southern Baptist Church every Wednesday and Sunday. And there was really, I held it from them for a long time. I went through a lot of changes in my life. I was married, we had a child, I divorced. And it was time at that point in my life to be able to share with my family, okay, this is exactly who I was. I have been extremely blessed with my family. Mom passed 20 years ago, but I had shared this with her, and she was very accepting. My dad is kind of a very typical Southern man with maybe some typical prejudices as well, too. But you know what? He never disowned me. His love for me and what I was going through, we had to work through a lot of stuff to get there. But I was so blessed that he hung with me, my brother and his kids, my daughter, they all hung with me. But I want you to know that my story is really not typical. Working at Q Center and being in the trans community, the typical trans story is that you lose almost everyone. You get kicked out of your house, you get kicked out of your family. I have been extremely overly blessed by my family, but I want you to know I'm not the typical. It is really tough for most trans people.
And that leads me to the last question for you, which is, what is it like at Q Center day to day? Because you really are running into people who come in to see you, and you have to find ways to help them. So how is that going right now?
Well, luckily, one of the lovely things about Q Center is the fact that, even in Portland, we do need a safe place for LGBTQ people. We have lots of folks who show up at Q Center's door saying, I just came out today. I told my friend, I told my family, I don't know what to do, but they told me to come to Q Center. And most of those folks are trans people, actually, that come. So they show up they come to Q Center. Of course, they're welcome. I feel like it's one of my lovely blessings in life to be able to take my journey to be able to help those folks that come in our door that are just barely starting. We provide a number of support groups for trans people. We have 6 support groups so they can find community there. And then, just like I said, a safe place for them to be. But we have some gaps here in Portland that are really critical. If you're a youth, If you're transgender, you're homeless, you've got places to go. Outside In is an amazing organization. They serve a lot of trans youth there. If you're out of that age group, if you're homeless, you've got a real struggle. The only shelter that we know of that is pretty much trans competent is Right to Dream 2. They do an incredible job by offering space to trans homeless people. You can imagine how heartbreaking it is when you receive that call and the trans person says, I just got kicked out of my house, I don't have a place to stay, where do I go? I'm 35 years old. It is horrendous. We've got so much work to do in this city of trying to find a place for trans people to be there out of that age group. Also, too, I would say, too, with employment, there's a super high percentage of trans people actually lose their jobs when they transition. Of course, there's laws that here in Oregon that do cover that, but I think there's probably ways around that at times. I think trans people are woefully underemployed. There needs to be some work done in those issues as well, too. So we provide a safe space, a welcoming place. You can find community, but there's some larger issues actually to deal with.
Thank you. So NICO, tell us a little bit about the statewide work that Basic Rights Oregon is doing policy-wise around trans issues in Oregon.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. And so I think this wonderful panel has touched upon a lot of the areas that people across Oregon have been fighting for a long time. And the big issue areas that folks have been pushing for are, again, health, housing, employment, and safety, and dignity in general. And so Basic Rights Oregon has been fighting for, and with our colleagues and allies and community members, have been fighting for many years to ensure that all transgender people have access, equal access to live a life of dignity, live a life of that is happy and safe. And unfortunately, there have been really, I don't know if there's a great word other than unsurmountable. We will win, but it's been horrendous. And the barriers that people are facing on an everyday basis is heartbreaking. And a few things I'll highlight are our healthcare work. We had a campaign with many of you in the room for 4 or 5 years to try to ensure that transgender people have access to life-saving care they need to live truly who they are. And I can't tell you what a uphill battle that has been. And we were able to win in 2012, one of the first bulletins in the nation, to say that healthcare companies, private healthcare companies, can't have explicit exclusions in their policies that say, okay, we won't serve you because you're transgender. And that was explicitly in the policy. So we got that out in 2012. And last year, we were able to get Oregon Health Plan, Medicaid, to actually put in their policies that they will cover specific transgender healthcare procedures, which is a huge victory. But the challenge with that is that our bulletin is not working. Transgender people are still not having access to the life-saving care they need if they have private health insurance plans in Oregon. And our Oregon Health Plan, while a lot of people have been able to access transgender health care for the first time on Medicaid, which is a big deal because the majority of transgender people are way below the poverty line. And so the challenge, though, is that policy there's huge challenges getting implemented. So when people are so excited, transgender people are so excited that we finally have access to health care, but when they call folks on the phone, people have no idea that is a covered benefit, the actual employees. And so it's going to take a huge lift for this policy and every other policy we've been fighting for. Another big thing is that transgender people have a hard time getting access to identity documents that they need. And so how many of you today used your Oregon State driver's license or ID card? Anyone? Okay. And how many of you, can you imagine, if you had a gender marker that didn't match who you are, how many of you think that you could have been a problem for you today with an officer, with a bank, anyone? So this is up until actually last year, it was extremely difficult for transgender people to get the gender marker that affirms who we are on our Oregon State driver's license identification cards because there was an antiquated policy in place. And so we fought to make sure that that was updated. But there are a lot of things, those are just two policies that we've been fighting for, and I'll stop soon, but there's a lot of policy areas that people don't even think about that are, could be life-saving for people, and that people just really, I think the one thing I'll leave for y'all is that the policy work and the advocacy work and people that are fighting today, unfortunately, we have probably a 10-year fight still to go to ensure that our trans communities are not experiencing extreme rates of mortality and morbidity, and that we are able to actually fully live healthy and happy lives. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that last year alone, I lost 4 friends, all transgender, and 1 I lost to suicide, 1 I lost to murder, and 2 I lost to health disparities. And I'm leave you with that as a heavy note, but we have a responsibility as a movement to not only not forget the T, but to work with our community members and to not let us fight alone. So many trans people have to appeal and fight alone to get these victories. And we need to do better to ensure that we tell them, our community members, that we are in solidarity with you, and especially for community members that are experiencing racism, transphobia, and classism, the barriers and the things that our communities face are devastating. So we need to work together to do better. So thank you.
So, NICO, there's something that you can also help us humanize. There's a language issue, right? So folks get tripped up in language, how they refer to their friends that are trans, how we refer to people that are not trans or that are straight. Can you help the sort of broader audience with that that struggle as we work through? Because I know that nobody wants to they don't want to hurt their friends or insult other people, but they also get tripped up. So do you want to break some of that down?
Yeah, I sure can, and I'm sure other folks on the panel could too. So specifically around the language of how to call like pronouns or general.
Pronouns, and people hear this word cis and they're like, hey sister, and that's not what it means.
No.
And so like maybe you want to break some of that down for folks.
There's a lot of odd language going on. Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a lot of different language going on. I think in general, the biggest thing I would say to leave people with about asking trans people about anything would be, do not ask a trans person anything you wouldn't feel comfortable asking your grandma. Right? So, you know, that's one. So, for example, over tea, I'm sure a lot of us on this panel have been asked really interesting things about our bodies that you wouldn't imagine, you know, over coffee or tea, someone asking you. So, yeah, so it's interesting. Pancreas, you know, ovaries, yeah, no, not over crumpets or whatever, coffee, no. So don't ask that. But the language, there's 3 general, this is simplifying, but not all trans people are the same, right? So there are a lot of trans communities, and I think basic terminology that folks need to really learn about is that the different communities have different names for themselves, different ways to identify. There are, in general, 3 main communities that we tend to advocate for and work with: trans feminine communities, trans masculine communities, and gender nonconforming communities, which could be in trans feminine or trans masculine or their own identities. And I think that in general the best thing to do is ask in a humanizing way how people identify and what they want to go by. In general, I say, I'm a he and him. What do you go by? And they might say, I'm a they and them. You're like, great. What's your favorite color? Blue. Wonderful. Do you want pizza? Great. Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful. And do you want to say what cisgender means? I'm guessing people in radio land may not understand what that means.
Yeah, cisgender is a funny word. But basically, cis means on the same side in Latin, I think, right? Anyone? Okay, good. And then trans means to cross over. So instead of saying non-trans, because it's kind of otherizing, right? You want to say, people in community say cisgender. Now, my comms director will be like, never say that word, because no one understands what it means. So when we talk to general public, the word is people who are not transgender and people who are transgender, because people think we're talking about a weird pie or something odd when we say the term cisgender. But
Great. Okay, so just a reminder that if you have questions in the audience, you can raise your cards up, and City Club volunteers and staff will come pull them. And so I am going to start with the first question, and any of you feel free to jump in. In our popular culture, there is a greater visibility of trans people. We seem to be at a tipping point, but how do we translate that visibility into greater social economic justice for trans people?
Well, I think what is so wonderful is that we do have these very visible examples of trans people today, which you couldn't have said that 10 years ago, basically. So that is amazing and wonderful, but we also have to know that the typical trans experience is not that. It's something totally different. I guess the way I like to approach that is that this actually gives us a wonderful opening because, you know, more people now maybe know about transgender folks versus, you know, Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner. It opens up that conversation, I think, now to talk about these more pressing issues of homelessness, of discrimination, of those type of things.
Anyone else? No? Do you feel the need now to conform to those? So there was a little hoopla around I've watched too much Kardashians, around Caitlyn Jenner being on the cover of Vanity Fair and projecting this image of femininity that some women are trying to get away from, this idea of like va-va-voom. And do you feel like that now adds extra pressure to who you are as a woman and how you must now present as a trans woman? Like, if Caitlyn Jenner can be glamorous, why can't everyone be glamorous?
Well, that is a really good question. I think there is, as NICO mentioned, there is such amazing diversity in the trans community, just like there is in the cisgender community. So, I mean, sure, we can claim that part. We can claim lots of other parts as well, too. I think part of where maybe the problem comes into, if people maybe focus on that, is the only representation of trans people, I think is very difficult. But you know, I think we can, gosh, I mean, we've made these extraordinary steps to be who we are. We can be whoever we want to be, you know, so it's glammed up or not. Or I love to hike. I look pretty grubby out on the trail. So.
And so do you feel like your definition of feminism is being co-opted? Like, there was a New York Times op-ed that this woman said that trans women are coming in and trying to co-opt feminism, and that's not my understanding of how feminism works. And so did that affect you at all, or the way that you as you relate as a woman?
Well, and I hate to be answering all these questions. Maybe somebody else has got something to jump in. But yeah, this is a conversation kind of raging in the trans community right now, in the feminist circles. Is kind of, how is this described? How is it defined? I think that what we have to come to is that we all evolve, the world evolves. I understand on some level where this op-ed came from. It was a radical feminist in her 60s who had basically experienced life as a lesbian radical feminist in the 50s and 60s in a really pretty harsh way. So I understand where those feelings and those thoughts come from. But, you know, this is a different day and time. We have to evolve. We have to move on. I mean, you look today at the younger generation, which is really going to be the savior of all of us, actually, I think. They have a totally different take on this. They totally embrace trans people in this discussion. And I think it's going to be the way moving forward, actually, is that.
Wonderful. These are great questions, by the way, that are sending up to the microphone. Okay. What more can we do in education at all levels, including parental education, to make the quote-unquote strange familiar, and please address otherizing and exclusions?
I think that we, you know, as a community, really need to focus on our young children because, you know, children start to, you know, learn stereotypes and gender roles, like, really as soon as they're born. And so really working to eliminate those and know that we, all of us, you know, succumb to those stereotypes in some way or another, and being able to recognize that we all do it, and then, you know, take a step back and look at that and really, maybe, say it a different way, or address this person differently, I think is really important. So just being really mindful of, all the stereotypes that, do play into everyday life.
I guess I would love to address this too, and I think that one way that we can act is if you are part of an organization or a company, to ensure that your company has a non-discrimination statement or policy, and also put in training and try to ensure that you have investment and money into training your staff, as well as hiring transgender people to do that training and to be on your staff. So how many people here are in organizations that have non-discrimination policies? Great. How many people here have, your organization hires trans people and actively tries to hire trans people? Wonderful. So I think that's one way that we really can work to move the needle on this and make a big difference.
And I'll just throw in for the parental piece, there's a great organization in town called Transactive, and they work with parents, and they work with kids from birth to 18 who are not able to transition yet because they're not of age, and so there are a lot of parental resources there as well. Next question. This one's tough, so get ready. I've been hearing a lot of folks, in parentheses, Fox News, compare Rachel Dolezal's identifying as black to trans folks identifying as another gender. Transracial compared to transgender. Does anybody want to brave that one?
I don't know why I said I'd take that, but I will. It's really easy to make that conflation because she's someone who's saying, I am black, I've always identified this way, and you hear trans people say similar things. But it is different because if you are born with a certain racial and ethnic and heritage, that's who you are. And to try to say, I'm not that, I look at that and I think that is one screwed up family. I mean, that was really my first, as a therapist, my first assessment of the situation. This is someone who's trying to become someone else other than who she is, and why would you want to divorce your family like that? And I just thought on a lot of levels there's something wrong there. But when someone says, I've always been a girl, or I've always felt different, or I didn't know what it was, that's not really the same thing. The parents, nothing in that family structure is driving that identity emergence. If this was not an innate identity, there would be no such thing as LGBTQ anybody, if it was something that was actually part of nurture and not part of nature. So I just don't see it as the same thing at all. And transracial is a real word. That is the word that describes somebody who's being raised by parents who are not the same race they are. So if you are white parents and you adopt a black child, that's a transracial family. But it has nothing to do with the child transitioning their ethnic or racial identity. It's a whole different thing to my mind.
Right. And so, I was just going to put JAYCE on the spot, because you are trans and you are black, and so I'm curious what you think about what she did.
Yeah, I knew it was gonna come my way, so it always does. When I read about it, I was like, this is really interesting. I think for me, the biggest thing is that, it screams blackface to me. The way that she is, saying that she's black, she's only taking on like the good characteristics. And there's so much more to being black that a lot of people don't realize, the implicit racism and the explicit racism that African Americans have to deal with. And I think, as an individual who, she looks, could pass as, mixed, but she has light skin. And so I don't think she understands that, having light skin gives her a pass, even though she doesn't realize it. And so I think it really takes away from the experience of a black person in today's society.
I'm going to talk for 1 sec about white privilege. This is a person who, when it suited her, sued her college as a white person, saying that she was treated differently because of her white race. Later, when it suited her, she crossed over, supposedly, and identified as a black woman, I think in part because she felt that gave her more power as the head of the NAACP. The NAACP has a long history of powerful and incredible white allies who have stood side by side with the black community doing meaningful civil rights work. And had she been authentic about her identity, I think she could have been a powerful ally and advocate for the black community in the United States. But white privilege is when you can choose which place you want to have when it gives you a higher position of power. And so I think that's a really, really different experience than the trans community has here in the United States.
Yeah, I was going to mention, talk a little bit about that, and so I think what I would just add is that it just is another example of systemic racism and institutional racism and how it perpetuates in our society, and that that this is exactly an example of white privilege, and that it is very different than a transgender person, a transgender experience. And I understand a lot of people have a challenging time understanding the differences between oppressions and how they operate, and this is different. This is different.
Caroline, this is specifically for you. Can you speak to federal policies? And I'm assuming they mean federal transgender policies.
Yeah, you know, we do, policy work nationally on behalf of the LGBT immigrant community. So the majority of our policy work, as I mentioned before, is focused on a couple things. One, the one-year filing deadline for asylum. There's a one-year filing deadline when you're applying for asylum, and for many people, particularly the trans community, who might come here because they know they're trans and feel that they can't live a life of safety in their home country, come to the United States seeking safety, and it takes more than a year for them to engage in a process and a transition of what it means to come out as a trans person. And so that one-year filing deadline for LGBT immigrants does not work. It does not work if you are really struggling with trauma-related mental illness. Our clients are some of the bravest people I've ever met, and they have been through extraordinary persecution to come here and seek safety. They have been victims of rape, of torture, of having their houses and their bodies burned, forced into marriage, isolated, disowned by their families. And so all of that is heavy stuff. To say that you have to, find a lawyer when you come here so isolated and navigate what we know is such a complicated legal system for anyone, let alone someone who does not speak English as their first language, is in an isolated place. It just doesn't work for our community. So we advocate against the one-year filing deadline. We think, like other countries who have asylum programs, there should be no filing deadline. If you're fleeing persecution, you should have a right to stay here safely. That, I feel has an adverse effect, particularly on the trans community, because our trans clients are more likely to be HIV positive, to have been detained, to have trauma-related mental health, to have experienced homelessness, and other issues that can prevent them from filing for asylum. The other one is the trans community who is in detention centers. We don't think that trans people should be detained unless, in the rare exception, they might be a threat to national security, which hasn't been any client we've ever had, I'll tell you now. So we think in particular for the trans community, because the harm is so great, sexual assault and persecution once again in our own detention centers, we think the trans community should be let out on community programs and truly not be in our detention centers. So those are our two most important priorities.
Okay. And this one dovetails with the previous question. How long are people usually held in detention centers at the border, and what makes your cases successful for release?
Yeah, that's a great question. There really is a range. So 5 years ago, there's a law that says, you're entitled to an interview for asylum, which is really the first step towards getting asylum within 45 days. Of applying for one. Today, because our immigration system is so backed up and so overloaded, we need more asylum officers, more immigration judges. Our clients today are getting an asylum interview for 2017 or even 2018. That entire period of time that they're waiting to have their day in court, they're undocumented, they have no work authorization, and they are incredibly vulnerable. They can also be picked up and put in detention centers. So our clients sometimes are in detention for a few months, and sometimes they're in detention for years. For our trans clients in particular, who are just more likely to be victims of sexual assault, they're also moved through detention centers across our nation. So we've had clients who have been sexually assaulted in a detention center in Texas, then moved to a detention center in Georgia where they're again sexually assaulted, then moved to a different detention center where they again experience persecution. So there's a huge range, sometimes 3 months, sometimes a few years, and sometimes they move around within the detention centers. An asylum claim is based on a reasonable fear of persecution. So we establish that you come from a fundamentally unsafe place. There are about 80 countries in the world, so about half, where it is a crime to be LGBT in some way, either to be gay, to be trans, or to express that, called anti-propaganda law in Russia, which is being copycatted through that entire region of the world. So one, we have to establish that the country is unsafe for LGBT people, and then you can pursue an asylum claim. The number one reason we have to turn clients away, 35% of the time we turn someone away, it's because of the one-year filing deadline, because they did not file in a timely manner, which is just incredibly difficult. We only serve clients living at or below the poverty line, so it can be incredibly difficult for our clients to get the resources and the advocacy to navigate the system.
Okay. There's so many good questions, you guys. I feel like we need to have like a blog after this to post them. How can we improve the experiences of trans folks in public facilities like restrooms and gendered spaces when so many disparities happen in these places?
I guess I can speak to that to begin with. So, I know my colleague here talked a little bit about national policies, and there have been a lot of national policies that made a huge difference most recently in a lot of these areas. Bathroom access is one of the things that we have to do on a local level and on a state level. And so in Oregon, we have the Oregon Equality Act, which is a really wonderful, it passed in 2007. And the challenge with Oregon Equality Act is that it doesn't always cover everything and explicitly stating that, oh, in Lynn County, you can't discriminate against someone in the restroom, et cetera, et cetera. So what's helpful with bathroom access specifically is having local ordinances that spell out specifically how transgender people should be treated in public facilities and restrooms. While transgender folks and all LGBTQ people are protected under the Oregon Equality Act against discrimination, having very clear specific ordinances that transgender people have the right to access the restroom that affirms their gender identity is really helpful. In DC, I was with the DC Trans Coalition for many years, and we had a bathroom campaign that successfully advocated for single-stall restrooms having to be gender neutral. And so that was one really successful campaign that ensured that if there is a single-stall restroom, at least one will be a place where a transgender person doesn't have to fear going to the bathroom. So.
Okay, I think we only have, this is the last question. What is the role of medical providers in improving the lives of trans people in this community? And how well prepared are they? And how does their training need to change? Reed.
As a therapist, I wrote a lot of referral letters for doctors to read, to prescribe hormones for people and provide surgery. What I found is that there are 3 doctors here in town that I routinely referred people to because I knew they had a very good understanding of trans issues and they were respectful of identity. Everybody else, I thought, well, it's a crapshoot because it's a very conservative profession, the medical profession, and it's a mixed bag. I heard horror stories about the ER from every single hospital in this city, from one trans client or another, and I'm including OHSU in that. Over a period of 10 years, probably 20 people had really bad things to say of things that happened to them in the ER. This is the medical system, the insurance system is one that is highly gendered. You have to check male, female, and if you do that, you are set on a certain track of tests you need, tests you do not need, things of that sort. So accessing really good medical care is very difficult, and this is one of the biggest differences between being gay, lesbian, and being trans. If you are trans and you choose a physical transition, if that's your path, you are tied to the medical system by your identity for the rest of your life. You will need hormone prescriptions renewed, you may need some form of surgery. The surgeries you get may put your body somewhere in between male and female. You may need a breast exam and a prostate exam, both. And that's the reality of someone who transitions physically. Then there are people who are in between in terms of their identity. Maybe they want to take hormones and have no surgeries at all. What does their doctor do with the body that appears to them non-standard? How do they handle that person? Are they wigged out about it? Do they treat that person respectfully? Doctors are people first, so they will have their own visceral reaction. And believe me, people who are gender nonconforming or trans in some way pick up on all of those reactions. It's really, it's in your face without other people even noticing it necessarily. So it's a difficult thing to do. I have found it's hard to talk to some doctors. They don't necessarily respect people with a master's degree like I have, and the mental health profession is sometimes seen as kind of woo-woo and pseudoscience and things like that. So it can be difficult to talk to doctors and get what I would consider a really good response. I find other doctors talking to doctors can be helpful. I'm doing a presentation for the National College of Naturopathic Medicine next month at their conference, and I'm looking forward to that because educating the medical profession is huge when you're a population that has to deal with it.
We've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join me in offering our sincere thanks for today's panelists for an enlightening discussion. We are adjourned.